Okay, so this is a screencast of the statistics part of the lecture I gave. That was the main part, which I didn't manage to get to finish. But let's go through this. So basically, in terms of research methods and statistics, in terms of quantitative research methods, some of the things we're going to be talking about today is the point of research, generalizing from samples. I'm going to be talking about types of measurement, summarizing data in numbers, things like such as central tendency and dispersion, but I'm also going to be talking about things such as what parametric assumptions are, and also looking at things like effect sizes, because they're really important and often neglected in psychological research methods. The research process, nearly every single piece of research is attempting to kind of take some sample, some smaller group of people, if it's the case of psychology, and trying to make some generalizations to the population as a whole. Now, whether that's quantitative psychology or qualitative psychology, there's nearly always some attempt to try and make some generalizations about a particular population from studying a smaller set of people, because trying to deal with an entire population can be extremely expensive, and how do you access the entirety of whatever population you're interested in? So we're trying to make some kind of generalization. We're trying to look at a small group of people and say, well, from this particular group of people, we can try and make some kind of claims about the population as a whole. An important point to point out here is that when we say population, we don't necessarily mean the population of the world. We don't necessarily mean everybody. It could be everybody, of course it could. If we're looking at personality or intelligence or memory or something like that, we might be generalizing to everybody. We're making some claims about how humans as a species do things. But populations don't necessarily need to be everybody. And this is a really important point to bear in mind. It could just be women. We might just be generalizing to women, excluding men. Or we might be just looking at men of a particular age, and that's our population. We might be looking at unmarried Catholic women, British females who suffer from depression, or people called Barry. Whatever it happens to be, that is our population. And why this is important is quite often you will hear people saying or read things, particularly in students' work, who might say something like, well, you know, one of the problems with this piece of research is that it's not very representative of the population. This sample isn't very representative of the population, but you need to understand what the population is. So a project I marked a number of years ago was looking at the use of the dating app Tinder, and one of the claims that the student made was, well, there's a problem with this research because it only looked at people between the ages of 18 and 35 or whatever it was, and this is unlikely to be representative of the population as a whole. Well, what do we mean by population? What we mean by population in this particular instance isn't necessarily the population of the world, but is the population of Tinder users. And it could well be, and it probably is the case, that 18 to 35 is exactly the target population, and it might not make sense to query people who are 70 or 80 about the use of Tinder when they don't use it, and they're not particularly representative of the population. So population means the group of people you're interested in generalizing to. That might be everybody, but it might also be some kind of subset. Most samples, we try and have some kind of principled way of selecting them. Random sampling is something which is often talked about, and people often misuse the word random terribly, and we need to be clear about what random means. Random absolutely does not mean just grab a bunch of people. There's this kind of, the use of the word random people kind of means just a kind of ad hoc group of people that you've just kind of grabbed and used for your study. That's not what random means at all. If you're talking about a random sample literally means that every member of the population that you're interested in has an equal opportunity of being selected to participate in your research, right? So that might mean getting a list of the names of all the people who the researchers will apply to, so the research of the population, getting a list of those names, getting some kind of random number generator, and say, like, picking the 27th person, and then the 1,222nd person, right? So each person has an equal chance of participating, and that's what random sample means. This is obviously extremely difficult to do. Some research does this, some research tries to do this. Much research can't do this simply because it's very difficult to actually get a list of all the people and give each person an equal opportunity to participate, because they might not want to take part in the research, in which case we do get a problem of self-selection. So it becomes very difficult to do this. Stratified is even more complicated to do, but this is where you try and make the sample representative of the population by ensuring that you have equal numbers of males, females, the demographic of the particular group in terms of their socio-economic status and so on. Is a good sample is relevant to the population you're interested in. Again, very difficult, but ideally this is what you want to do. Most people, and particularly your research, will probably use something like this: opportunity sampling, convenience sampling, or sometimes accidental sampling. This is often frowned upon because, of course, it leads into all kinds of problems such as self-selection. Self-selection is a problem for lots of reasons, because if you're looking at if you're looking at mental illness, for example, it might be that only the people with the most extreme forms of the mental illness take part in your sample, or it might mean that even the people with the less extreme forms, simply because the people who've got the more extreme forms are unwilling to participate or unable to participate. So it is problematic, but it's kind of okay for the point of view of quite a lot of research, particularly the kind of research you'll be doing, so long as you make sure that the sample is a reasonable fit to the population, given the research question. So you're trying to find people who are in the particular target population, that you're getting an equal balance of males and females, if that's relevant, or ages, or students and non-students. So try and think about what the population is, what kind of demographic characteristics might be in that population, and so long as you make an attempt to try and ensure that you recruit people which match that particular population, then this is a perfectly okay thing to do. But also it's important to recognise any limitations that might be in there. So, check against the population. Is the population likely to be older than yours, younger than yours? Have you got over-representative of middle-class people, that kind of stuff? Sample size is an important thing. It's very important to consider this, and one of the most common questions that I'm asked when I'm a research supervisor is, how many participants do I need? My response is usually as many as you can get, so long as they ideally meet the demographics of the population. And there are a number of reasons for this, and this is one reason. The question is, if we have two groups of people, and we measure the heights of those people, one group contains 10 people, the other group contains 100 people. Which of these two groups is more likely to contain is to have an average height of over 6 feet, assuming there are no other differences between the two groups? Is group 1 more likely to have an average height of over 6 feet? Is group 2 more likely to have an average height of over 6 feet, or is there no difference? I'll give you a second to ponder that. The answer is actually group 1 is. The fact is that the smaller the sample, the more likely that the mean person within that sample, if we're talking about people, the more likely that person, the average person is likely to be either very tall compared to the average, or much above the average, or very, very short. So the same question could be asked, which is most likely to have somebody under the height of, 5'4". Again, it's going to be group 1. So the bigger the sample, all else being equal, the more likely that sample is to be representative of the population as a whole in terms of averages. So bigger samples are better. Bigger samples are better. Now, if you want, there are ways of trying to work out effect size. Ideally, we want the bigger the better, but obviously, if I say to a student, try getting 10,000 people, they're going to kind of look at me rather blankly. So there are ways of trying to calculate this. There are various calculators which you could speak to your supervisor about if you're interested in finding this out, which allow you to plug in a bunch of numbers concerning the research you're doing, and it will give you the ideal sample size. So if you want to find a particular size effect, if you want to find a particular significance level, you can plug those numbers and it will tell you how many participants you need to try and find an effect if it's there. Data is the kind of heartbeat of this research, really. It's what keeps it going. And it's important to bear in mind that data needs to be treated with caution. The kind of quantitative data that we have determines what we can do with it. in terms of how we summarize that data, so looking at things like measures of central tendency, they're things like means, medians, averages, or measures of dispersion, which we'll come to in a bit. Also, the kind of data you have determines which significance test you can perform on those data. We'll look at that later. All of this relates to a thing called parametric assumptions. Now, I've written parametric assumptions in this is supposed to be a slightly scary Gothic font, because this is something that a lot of students find kind of a bit terrifying, really. Parametric assumptions, it sounds kind of scary, but basically it's a relatively simple kind of idea, which we'll go through step by step, because this becomes particularly important in the next module that you'll be doing on statistics and research methods, which will be in semester 2 for many of you. And this is a semester 2 module called Research Methods and Measurement Issues in Health Psychology, or RMMI for short. And in this particular module, we get you to do relatively advanced statistics. This is partly why this module was created, to try and get you up to speed with the basics, so that you can hit the ground running when you do the more advanced stuff. And one of the things that's very important when you use these slightly more sophisticated tests, as well as the simpler ones that we'll be looking at in this module, is whether the data can actually be used for the tests that you want to do. Is the data appropriate? Is it an appropriate test to use on this particular data? And parametric assumptions is one of the things that you need to go through in order to determine whether you can use the appropriate test. One of the first things you need to look at is the kind of data you have. Okay, and there are essentially 4 kinds of data, quantitative data, that you need to attend to. You need to decide which kind of data do I have. The simplest kind of data is called nominal data. This is simply from the Latin meaning to name. I only mention that because if you think name in your head when you're thinking about nominal, it kind of gives you an inkling about what this is. It can help you remember. These are the kind of things that children tend to learn first. When children start to categorize the world, they start to give things names. You know, their mummy, daddy, doggy, me, you, chair, that kind of stuff. This kind of data is simply names. There's no numbers in it at all, simply names. So we might be interested, for example, in whether males or females are more likely to park in a disabled bay than not park in a disabled bay. These will be non-disabled people, to see whether males are more likely to cheat than females, for example. And our data here might just be males, females, parks in a disabled bay, doesn't park in a disabled bay. No numbers at all, just categories. To summarize this kind of stuff means are completely meaningless. You can't add, males and females together and come up with something halfway between a male and a female, because, that wouldn't make any sense in the data. So we tend to use proportions or percentages. 26% of men compared to 45% of women parked in a disabled parking bay. That kind of stuff. The next kind of data is called ordinal data, and this is called ordinal data because this is simply putting things in order. Again, this is the kind of thing children might do. Once they've started to name things, they'll start categorizing things in terms of maybe how big they are or how heavy they are. They might say, this is bigger than this teddy bear is bigger than this, and this teddy bear is bigger than this, so this is the smallest. So we've got small, medium, large, right? We might say fast, faster, fastest, slow, slower, slowest, that kind of stuff. But the important thing here is there's no sense as to how much the biggest thing is than the second biggest thing, and how much the second biggest thing is relative to the third biggest thing. Right? The order of magnitude here is missing from this. So you might have a very large teddy bear and a teddy bear which is nearly as big as the biggest teddy bear but a little bit smaller, and a tiny teddy bear. Now we still have big, bigger, biggest, or whatever we have, or small, bigger, biggest, but it doesn't capture the difference in size. Similarly, in a race, first, second, third, we don't know whether the first person, might beat the second person by, fractions of a second, but the second person beat the third person by several minutes. That is not captured in ordinal data. All we know is first, second, and third. And because of this, it doesn't make any sense, again, to use a mean. So what we might use here is the median or something like this.